I'm Avery Morgan, 27, and the morning it all cracked open, we were wedged in the check-in line at Hartsfield-Jackson, the air full of coffee steam and rolling suitcases, my grandfather's leather carry-on tucked against his leg like an old friend. He had dressed up for the flight, pressed shirt, polished shoes, that hopeful smile he saved for family photos, because he believed this was the trip that would draw us back to one table, one laugh, one memory. My father was charming the agent, my mother scrolling, my aunt comparing hotel lists, and I tried to ignore the hollow echo in their voices when they told him how special this would be. Then I saw the agent's face change the way a sky hardens before rain. She looked at the screen, then at Grandpa, and her mouth turned careful. My father leaned close and said something soft that landed like a slap. My grandfather's hand tightened on the handle knuckles, white against brown leather. I realized I was hearing the truth not for the first time, but for the first time without excuses. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and if you've ever held your ground for someone you love, tap like and subscribe, so this story reaches the next person who needs it. I grew up in a modest bungalow outside Charleston, where the porch sagged a little and the hydrangeas always tried to swallow the walkway, and where kindness was not something we talked about so much as something my grandfather practiced without asking permission. Thomas Morgan started with a pickup truck, and a tool belt turned long days into steady work, and steady work into a handful of rental properties that became more than anyone expected. Through all of it, he still made time to pick me up from school when my parents got stuck at the office, and he clapped at my middle school piano recital as if I'd sold out a theater. He taught me small rules that felt like bedrock: show up on time, tell the truth, even when it stings, don't confuse price for worth, and I tucked them into the pockets of my life the way other girls tucked lip gloss. When I was old enough to notice the difference between our side of town and the gated communities where my parents hosted charity dinners, I saw two versions of family competing for the same last name: the warm, flour-dusted kitchen where Grandpa cut pie slices too big, and the glossy rooms where my father measured affection by how well a story played on social media. The gap grew each year, quiet and steady, like a tide pulling two boats in opposite directions. By the time I was finishing my grad internship at a local arts nonprofit, the Morgan name meant invitations I didn't ask for and expectations I didn't share. My parents, Robert and Diane, moved like they owned every room. They were generous with appearances, careful with effort, and always a little put out when Grandpa told stories that ran longer than a cocktail hour. My Aunt Valerie loved a bright entrance and a quick exit, and her husband Peter called every opportunity brilliant if it could be charged to someone else's card. Jenna and Logan learned early to glaze over when older people spoke, as if listening cost more than they could afford. Still, when my grandfather mentioned a family trip, a long-planned all-together adventure through Europe, his voice carried that old steady hope, and I wanted to believe we might meet him halfway. It was easy to picture him standing beneath the Eiffel Tower, like a man greeting an old dream at last. The weeks before departure were full of gestures that looked like affection from a distance and something thinner up close. My father phoned Grandpa with soft questions about sleep and blood pressure. My mother sent a scarf that was too fine to wear. My aunt dropped off chocolates with a laugh that sounded rehearsed, and the cousins posted countdowns like they were part of a campaign. When Grandpa showed me the itinerary, first-class seats, quiet hotels near city centers, a ride along the Seine, I watched his eyes settle on each line with the care he once used to memorize multiplication tables with me at the kitchen table. I noticed, too, the way he kept glancing toward the door after every call, the way a man looks for proof that this time the promise will match the plan. Part of me wanted to ask the hard question, to press on the soft spots in the story, but I didn't. I told myself he deserved to enjoy the anticipation without the weight of my doubt. On the morning we left Charleston for Atlanta, the house he built felt like it was holding its breath. He came down the stairs in that pressed shirt, carrying the old leather bag that had followed him through decades of site visits and road trips, and he patted the pocket where he kept his passport with a care that made my throat tight. My father was unusually cheerful as he loaded suitcases, my mother already drafting a post about finally slowing down, my aunt chattering about rooftop views. the car filled with talk of wine tastings and photo ops, while the person who paid for every mile sat quietly beside me, tracing the seam of his bag with one finger. As the interstate opened wide, the conversation in the front seat turned to upgrades and reservations, and the differences between the life I knew and the life they performed felt less like a contrast and more like two separate languages spoken under the same roof. I promised myself I would be his translator if the day asked for it. At the airport, the lines moved fast, the announcements clipped and cheerful, and the air tasted like espresso and jet fuel. Grandpa stood a little taller when the agent greeted him, and I stood close enough to hear the keys click and the pause stretch, then stretch again. My father's smile didn't reach his eyes. As he stepped forward, my mother's expression smoothed into something neutral, and a small knot formed in my chest, the way a storm gathers on the horizon before anyone remembers to bring in the chairs. I thought about all the times he had shown up for me without asking if it was convenient, and I felt a single steady certainty rise to meet the moment. What happened next would tell me exactly which version of our family we were taking on this trip and which version would be going home. The agent's fingers hovered over the keyboard, the screen glow reflecting off her glasses. She typed Thomas Morgan's name once, then again. A quiet pause stretched into something heavier. She glanced at my father, then back at the monitor. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "There's no reservation under that name." Grandpa's smile faltered, but only slightly. He straightened his shoulders, the way he always did when he wanted to give others time to fix their mistakes. "There must be some error," he said. "My son arranged the tickets." My father stepped forward with the calm of someone used to taking charge. "That's strange," he said smoothly, leaning on the counter. "Let's not hold up the line. Maybe the system missed an update." His voice was polite, but his eyes told a different story, flat, unmoved, prepared. The agent tried again, her fingers moving quickly, then she shook her head. "No, sir. I've checked all itineraries. There's nothing for a Mr. Thomas Morgan." My grandfather turned to my father, his confusion settling into something smaller, quieter. "Robert," he said, "didn't you add me to the booking?" The question hung in the air like a note that didn't fade. My father's jaw tightened. "Dad, I forgot your ticket," he said finally. "Just go home." The sound of it didn't match the place we were standing. The airport noise dimmed behind a rushing silence, and for a heartbeat, even the people in line seemed to stop moving. My grandfather's hand trembled on the handle of his suitcase. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came. My mother touched his arm, her tone too gentle to be sincere. "It's a long flight, Dad," she said. "You're not in the best shape for that kind of travel. We'll bring you something special from Europe." It was supposed to sound kind. It didn't. Grandpa blinked once, twice, the lines around his eyes deepening as he searched each face for some sign of misunderstanding. None came. My Aunt Valerie sighed and whispered something to her husband. My cousins scrolled on their phones, pretending not to hear. I could feel the air around us shift, the invisible line between love and shame drawn right there at the counter. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice sharper than I expected. "He paid for everything. You're really going to leave him here?" People turned. My father gave me a warning look, the kind he'd used since childhood to end conversations before they began. "Enough, Avery," he said. "Don't make a scene." Valerie glanced around nervously. "Avery, lower your voice," she hissed. "You're embarrassing everyone." I stepped closer to Grandpa, blocking him from their stares. "What's embarrassing," I said quietly, "is pretending this is normal." My father's face hardened. "You don't understand the full picture," he said, forcing a tight smile for the people watching. "Dad's not up for this kind of trip. It's for his own good." Grandpa shook his head faintly. "If it's too much trouble, I can go home," he whispered more to himself than anyone else. His suitcase handle squeaked in his grip. My chest ached at the sight. "No," I said firmly. "You're not going home alone." My father leaned in close, his voice low. "If you stay, don't expect me to help you later. You'll regret it." The words came out like a final order, one that expected obedience. But I couldn't move. I could only look at the man who had built everything these people enjoyed, who had stood in the back row of my graduation with tears in his eyes, and who now stood forgotten under fluorescent lights. "Then I'll regret it," I said. "But I'm not leaving him." Valerie rolled her eyes. "She's always been dramatic," she muttered. "Don't let her ruin this." My mother put a hand on my father's arm. "We need to go, Robert," she said. "We'll miss the flight." He nodded, snapped his suitcase shut, and without looking back led them toward the gate. My aunt followed her heels, clicking against the tile. Jenna and Logan trailed behind, still on their phones, never glancing up. And just like that, they were gone. For a moment, I couldn't move. The crowd flowed around us like a current, but we were the only two standing still. Grandpa stared at the departure screens, his expression blank, his shoulders slumped. "Maybe they're right," he said finally. "Maybe I don't belong anymore." I reached for his hand, wrapping it tightly in mine. "You do," I whispered. "You belong with me." His fingers tightened slightly, a small sign that he heard me. The agent behind the counter looked down uncomfortable and quietly slid his passport back across the desk. I took it along with the tickets he'd bought for the others folded neatly in the folder he'd been carrying. Then I guided him away from the counter through the terminal, past the bright signs and coffee stands until we stepped outside into the heavy Georgia heat. The taxi ride back to Charleston stretched into a silence that felt miles long. He sat with his suitcase balanced on his knees, staring out the window as the city lights blurred by. Every so often his reflection caught in the glass. Strong jaw, white hair, tired eyes, and I thought about how many times those same hands had steadied me when I was little crossing streets or learning to ride a bike. Now he was the one holding on to keep from shaking. Halfway down the highway he spoke so softly I almost missed it. "Maybe I'm just outdated," he said. I turned toward him. "You're not outdated," I said. "They are." He gave me a faint smile, one that didn't reach his eyes, and looked away again. The rest of the ride passed in quiet, the hum of the tires filling in what words couldn't. When we reached the estate, the iron gates opened with their usual slow creak, and the mansion appeared under the pale glow of the driveway lights. It was beautiful but hollow, the kind of beauty that made silence louder. Inside, the chandeliers sparkled, the marble floors gleamed, yet the house felt colder than I'd ever known it. Grandpa set his suitcase down in the foyer, the sound echoing through the empty space. "I built this for them," he murmured, looking up at the portraits lining the walls. "And tonight," I realized, "it means nothing." I followed him into his study, the one that smelled faintly of old books and cedar. He sank into the leather chair by the fireplace, pulled an old photo from the side table, and traced a finger over the younger faces captured there. Himself, my father, my aunt, all smiling in a summer long gone. The firelight flickered, casting moving shadows across his face. "Maybe I failed somewhere," he said quietly. I wanted to answer, but no words seemed right. So I sat beside him, the only sound the slow tick of the mantel clock. The warmth of the fire couldn't reach the ache in that room. At some point he drifted into a shallow sleep, the photograph still in his hand. I stayed there watching the light fade from the embers and made myself a promise I didn't yet know how to keep. The next morning the mansion was silent except for the distant murmur of the ocean. Sunlight fell across the study floor, catching the dust in slow motion. Grandpa was still in the chair, his face drawn, the photo resting on his lap. I poured 2 cups of coffee and set one beside him. "You don't have to talk," I said softly. He nodded, staring into the cup as if it held an answer. That moment settled something inside me. Whatever they had done at that airport, whatever excuses they would make later, I couldn't let it stand. They had taken his money, his trust, and tried to take his dignity too. They left him with a hollow house and a bruised heart, but I still had one thing they didn't proof of what was real. Outside the fountain murmured, and the morning air carried the scent of salt and magnolia. I looked at the house that once stood for pride and now felt like a monument to regret. Somewhere in those polished rooms lay the truth buried beneath signatures and plans. I would find it, and when I did, they would finally see the man they'd tried to erase. That was the promise that carried me into the next day, the beginning of something I couldn't yet name, but knew would change everything. The morning light came in soft and gold through the tall windows, touching the corners of the study where my grandfather had fallen asleep the night before. The fire was cold now, just gray ash and a faint scent of smoke. He sat slumped in the armchair, still holding the photograph in one hand. For a long time I just stood there, not wanting to wake him, not ready to see the look in his eyes when he opened them. When he finally stirred, he blinked up at me dazed, as if unsure where he was. "Did they get off all right?" he asked. His voice was raspy dry. I hesitated, then nodded. They did. He pressed his lips together, nodding as if that answer carried more weight than I'd meant it to. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that filled every room like dust. I set a cup of coffee on the table beside him. "You should eat something," I said quietly. He didn't respond, just stared at the flames that weren't there anymore. After breakfast, I went upstairs to shower, but the stillness of the house pressed down so hard it made the air feel thick. Every polished surface, every family portrait suddenly looked different. It wasn't a home anymore. It was proof of everything he'd built and everything they'd taken for granted. When I came back downstairs, he was in his office sorting through mail without really seeing it. I watched him from the doorway for a while, trying to find the right words, then gave up and crossed the room. "I want to look through some things," I said. "Maybe figure out what happened with the trip. It doesn't make sense." He looked up at me, eyes tired. "Leave it, Avery. It's done." But I couldn't. I waited until he went to the garden, then pulled open the drawers of his desk. The first few folders were nothing unusual. Tax forms, property deeds, donation receipts. But then I found a slim manila folder labeled Travel Itinerary. Inside were printouts and receipts neatly paper-clipped together. One page caught my eye immediately, a wire transfer receipt dated 6 weeks earlier. $2 million moved from my grandfather's investment account into my father's personal one. My throat went dry. The next few pages confirmed it: hotel bookings, private transfers, first-class flights, all names listed except his. My heart pounded as I flipped through the papers again, hoping I'd misread something. But the pattern was clear. His name had been there, then crossed out. They hadn't forgotten him, they'd erased him. That afternoon, while he napped in the study, I drove downtown to a small travel agency tucked between a florist and a bakery. A brass plaque beside the door read, "Dawson Travel Group." Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and perfume. A woman in a crisp navy blazer looked up from her computer. "Good afternoon," she said. "How can I help you, Carla Dawson?" I asked. She nodded. "That's me." I took a slow breath and held up the folder. "You arranged a family trip for the Morgans, Charleston to Paris, then Rome and London. I need to confirm something." Her expression softened with recognition. "Oh, yes, I remember that one. Mr. Thomas Morgan. Lovely man. He came in with his son, I believe." She began typing on her keyboard, eyes flicking between screens. After a moment, her brows pulled together. "That's strange," she murmured. The original booking had Mr. Morgan listed. But look here. His name was removed just before final confirmation. The rest of the family stayed on the manifest. The words landed like a punch. "So it wasn't an error," I said. "Someone deleted him." Carla's mouth pressed into a thin line. "I can't speak to motive, but yes, that's what the record shows. Would you like me to print it?" I nodded. She handed me the pages along with a quiet, sympathetic look. "If you need a statement later," she said, "I'll provide one." I drove home slower than usual, the papers sitting on the passenger seat like evidence from a crime scene. The sun was setting by the time I pulled into the driveway. Grandpa was on the porch, his old leather jacket draped over his shoulders, watching the horizon. I joined him and set the folder on the table between us. "What's this?" he asked. "Proof," I said. "They took everything, Grandpa. You weren't meant to go." He flipped through the pages, his hands trembling. The color drained from his face. "Robert," he whispered, voice breaking on the name. "My own son." He leaned back in his chair and covered his mouth with one hand. For a long time we just sat there, listening to the crickets and the faint sound of waves in the distance. When he finally spoke again, It was so quiet I almost missed it. I always thought if I gave enough, they'd find their way back. I didn't see this coming. I reached for his hand. "We can still make this right," I said. "There are people who help with this kind of thing. They protect seniors when family takes advantage." He shook his head immediately. "No, I won't destroy them." His voice rose a little, the first flicker of anger I'd seen in days. "They're my children, Avery. What would that make me?" I took a slow breath. "It would make you someone who finally stops them from doing this again." He didn't answer. Instead, he looked out toward the garden, where the light was fading, the azalea bushes now just outlines in the dusk. "I wanted to leave them something to remember me by," he said. "Not this." Later that night, I found him in the same spot, sitting by the unlit fire, the folder open beside him. He didn't look up when I came in. "They destroyed themselves," I said softly. "You just didn't see it until now." His shoulders sagged, and after a long pause, he nodded once barely. "If you believe it's right," he said, "then I trust you." The next morning, I woke early. The house was quiet, except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of the sea. I sat at the kitchen table with my phone, the folder open beside me. It took 3 tries to steady my hand enough to dial. The man who answered introduced himself as Mark Ellis from Adult Protective Services. His tone was calm, professional. "Tell me what happened," he said. I told him everything from the planning of the trip to the scene at the airport to what I'd found in the folder. He didn't interrupt, only asked a few questions. "Do you have proof of the transfer?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "And a witness from the agency." There was a pause, then his voice changed, slightly more focused. "That's enough to start an investigation," he said. "I'll need statements and copies of your documents. Can you come in tomorrow?" When I hung up, my heart raced. The silence that had filled the house since the airport suddenly felt different, not empty, but waiting. Grandpa came into the kitchen, his hair still mussed from sleep. "You're up early," he said. I met his eyes and took his hand. "I made the call," I said. "They'll help us." He looked at me for a long moment, then gave a faint nod. "All right," he said softly, "if you think it's time." The morning light fell across the table, catching the edge of the coffee cup and turning it gold. Outside, the wind rustled the magnolia leaves, carrying the faint scent of salt from the coast. For the first time since that day at the airport, I felt something shift like a window opening after a storm. Neither of us spoke for a while. We didn't need to. The air between us held what words couldn't grief resolve, and the quiet beginning of a fight we hadn't planned but couldn't turn away from. And though I didn't yet know what would come of that call, I knew this much: the silence was over. 3 weeks passed slower than winter rain. Grandpa and I spent our days at the Charleston house, the ocean wind carrying salt through open windows and the sound of gulls cutting across the quiet. He tried to stay busy watering the rose bushes, straightening books on the library shelves, but I could see the ache beneath the small routines. Every time the phone rang, he flinched, half expecting a familiar voice, half dreading it. None of them called. Mark Ellis checked in regularly. He spoke with a steady, careful tone, never rushing me. He said his office was preparing the case, gathering financial records and witness statements. "We're close," he told me one morning over the phone. "It just takes time to document everything properly." I thanked him, though patience wasn't coming easily. Each day that passed felt like we were holding our breath underwater, waiting for something to break the surface. Grandpa and I rarely talked about the investigation directly. Instead, we moved through quiet habits: breakfast on the back porch, coffee refilled more than it was ever finished, evening walks down to the garden. But there was one night when I found him sitting in his study long after midnight, the same old photograph on the desk in front of him. I leaned on the doorway. "You should try to sleep," I said. He didn't look up. "Do you think," he asked, slowly, "a man can love his children too much?" I didn't answer right away. The room smelled of old paper and rain drifting in through the cracked window. "I think I said finally love can make us blind to who people really are." He nodded, eyes still on the photo. "That's what I'm afraid of." The following morning, Mark called again. His tone was different, sharper, more focused. "They're scheduled to land at Atlanta International tomorrow evening," he said. We'll serve them at the airport when they arrive." For a moment, all I could hear was my own heartbeat. "You'll be there?" I asked. "I'll be there," he confirmed. "I'll handle the paperwork. You just need to be with your grandfather." I hung up and sat very still. The house felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier. Grandpa came in a few minutes later, holding a small basket of herbs from the garden. "Who was that?" he asked. "It's time," I said quietly. His hand stilled, and for a long moment he just stared at the floor. Then he set the basket down and nodded. "All right," he said softly. "Let's finish this." The next day, we dressed in simple clothes, no suits, no pretense. Grandpa wore the same navy jacket he'd had since I was a child, the one with the frayed cuffs and the smell of cedar. We drove to Atlanta in silence, the road long and gray beneath a low sky. I watched the lines on his face deepen with every mile, but his posture stayed straight, the same quiet dignity he had always carried. When we arrived, the airport was a blur of voices, luggage wheels, and overhead announcements. We stood near the arrival gate a few steps back from the flow of travelers. Mark Ellis met us there, his briefcase tucked under one arm. "You ready?" he asked gently. Grandpa nodded once. "I've been ready for years," he said. A wave of passengers began to spill through the gate, dragging their glossy suitcases and duty-free bags. Then I saw them. My father in his tailored coat, sunglasses perched on his head, as though the world were his audience. My mother behind him, scrolling on her phone, her expression distant. Aunt Valerie and Uncle Peter followed, laughing at something I couldn't hear. Jenna and Logan trailed with armfuls of shopping bags, chattering about Paris boutiques. They looked untouched by what they'd done, like the betrayal had already faded into a family secret. They spotted us almost at the same moment. My father slowed, confusion flickering across his face. "Dad," he said, then forced a smile. "What are you doing here?" Grandpa didn't answer. Mark stepped forward and pulled out a stack of papers. His voice was calm, steady. "Robert Morgan, Diane Morgan, Valerie Brooks and Peter Brooks. You're being served with a summons regarding allegations of financial abuse against Mr. Thomas Morgan." The words seemed to hang in the air longer than sound should. My mother blinked, stunned. "This must be a mistake," she said quickly. "We didn't—" Valerie cut in, voice sharp. "Financial abuse." "Are you serious?" Mark handed each of them an envelope, his expression unreadable. "You'll need to appear in court. The details are all inside." People had started to slow around us, curious. My father's voice dropped low and dangerous. "Dad, tell them this isn't true. Tell them you wanted us to go." For the first time since the airport weeks ago, Grandpa straightened fully, his eyes steady. "I wanted us to go together," he said. "Not for you to abandon me." The color drained from my mother's face. Valerie shook her head, muttering to Peter, "This is ridiculous." I stepped forward, my pulse hammering. "It's not ridiculous," I said. "It's justice." My father turned toward me, disbelief hardening into anger. "You," he asked, "you're behind this." I met his stare without flinching. "Yes. I called them." My mother gasped. "Avery, how could you do that to your own family?" I felt Grandpa's hand on my shoulder, steadying me. "Because you stopped being family when you left him standing alone." The space around us grew quiet. A few travelers had paused nearby, pretending not to watch. Jenna looked away, cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Logan tugged on his headphones like he could drown it out. My father's jaw clenched. "You don't know what you've done," he said. "You've destroyed this family." I took a slow breath. "No," I said quietly. "You destroyed it when you chose greed over him." Mark closed his folder. "You'll receive court dates shortly," he said. "Failure to appear will result in further action." He nodded to Grandpa, then turned to leave. My father tried to call after him, but Mark didn't look back. As they stood there holding the papers they'd been served, the image of power my family had always worn started to crack. My mother's hands trembled. The corners of Valerie's polished smile faltered, and for the first time my father looked small against the noise of the crowd. Grandpa's grip on my hand tightened slightly. "You gave me back my voice," he whispered. I looked at him, the lights reflecting off his eyes, and said, "You never lost it, Grandpa. They just stopped listening. We turned away, leaving them standing there in the bright terminal, surrounded by their designer luggage and their silence. As the automatic doors opened to the warm Georgia air, Grandpa took a deep breath. It was the first time in months I'd seen his shoulders ease. The road ahead wasn't finished. There would be lawyers' hearings, more nights of waiting, but something in the air had shifted. The truth was no longer a secret, whispered behind closed doors. It was out in the open now, written in black and white on every page they held. And as we walked toward the parking lot, I could almost feel the old weight lifting, replaced by something steadier, something stronger, a sense that maybe, just maybe, the rest of this fight would finally lead us home. The ride home from Atlanta was quiet. The hum of the highway filled the car while Grandpa sat beside me, his hands folded on his lap. The tension that had shadowed him for weeks seemed lighter now, replaced by something calmer, like the air right after a storm. When we reached Charleston, the sky had turned a deep violet. He walked slowly up the steps to the porch, the soft creak of wood under his shoes echoing through the still night. Inside, he paused by the doorway, taking in the familiar space as though it had been returned to him. That evening, neither of us spoke much. He made tea instead of coffee and set 2 cups on the kitchen table. "You stood your ground," he said quietly. I shook my head. We both did. He looked out the window toward the garden. "No," he said. "You did what I couldn't." His voice carried no shame, only acceptance. The kettle clicked as it cooled, and for the first time since the airport, he smiled a small, weary smile that said he could finally breathe. The next morning, Mark Ellis called to confirm the next step. The investigation was officially being moved into court. He spoke with that same steady tone I had come to trust. "You'll both receive notices within the week," he said. "You'll testify, Avery. Your grandfather may not have to, depending on his condition." I agreed, though the thought of standing in a courtroom across from my family twisted my stomach. Mark paused before hanging up. "You did the right thing," he said. "Sometimes truth has to speak louder than blood." Days passed in slow rhythm. Grandpa spent hours tending to the roses, trimming back the old stems, as if restoring the garden restored something in him too. I joined him most mornings, handing him tools, listening to the quiet hum of bees. At night, he would sit in his study reading through old journals or letters. I found him once staring at a page so long the ink had begun to blur in his gaze. "It's strange," he murmured, "how many words I spent on people who never really listened." I didn't know what to say, so I reached across the desk and rested my hand over his. The court date came faster than I expected. The courthouse in Charleston stood at the edge of the historic district, its white columns bright under the morning sun. Inside, the air smelled faintly of polish and paper. Grandpa decided to stay home that day. "It's your turn now," he said as I left. "You've got my voice." Mark met me at the entrance, a briefcase under his arm. "Just tell the truth," he said. "That's all we need." In the courtroom, the space felt larger than it was: wooden benches, high ceilings, light streaming through tall windows. On the other side of the aisle sat my father, my mother, my Aunt Valerie, and Uncle Peter. They looked smaller in person than I remembered, as though the months since the airport had hollowed out something in them. Their attorney, a sleek man in a gray suit, whispered between them, his expression practiced and calm. When the judge entered the room, settled into silence. She was an older woman with silver hair pulled into a low bun and a tone that carried quiet authority. Mark began by outlining the case, the wire transfer, the false promises, the abandoned trip. He spoke simply, clearly, letting the facts do their work. The defense countered with practiced politeness, claiming that Grandpa had gifted the money willingly and that the trip was canceled for his own well-being. It was the same kind of story my family had told all their lives, polished enough to sound believable, hollow enough to crumble under light. When the judge called my name, my heart thudded in my chest. I walked to the stand, the wood creaking softly under my shoes. After I was sworn in, Mark's voice came steady. "Miss Morgan, can you tell the court what happened the morning of the flight?" I took a breath. "We were all at the check-in counter," I began. My grandfather was excited. It was the first time in years he'd planned something that included everyone. When the agent couldn't find his name on the booking, he looked to my father for an explanation. My father told him he'd forgotten the ticket and said, "Just go home." The words seemed to hang in the air. The courtroom stayed quiet, except for the sound of someone shifting on the bench behind me. "How did your grandfather react?" Mark asked. "He didn't yell," I said. "He just stood there holding his suitcase like someone had pulled the ground out from under him." Mark nodded gently. "And did he pay for the trip?" "Yes," I said. $2 million transferred from his account into my father's. He asked me about the travel agent, about the folder, about the days that followed. I answered everything as best I could. When I finished, I could feel my hands shaking in my lap. The defense attorney stood his smile too smooth. "Miss Morgan," he said, "is it possible your grandfather misunderstood the arrangement, that he offered this trip out of generosity?" I looked at him squarely. "He offered love," I said. "They took money." He blinked, then looked down at his notes. Mark called Carla Dawson next. She walked in with her usual calm, a neat folder in hand. She confirmed everything: the booking, the removal of Grandpa's name, the payment trail. Then came an airport staff member who testified to hearing my father's exact words. Each statement felt like a thread being pulled tighter until the picture finally came clear. Then my father rose from his seat. "Your Honor," he said, "this has gone too far. My father is elderly. He wouldn't have managed the trip. We spared him the exhaustion. That's all." The judge watched him carefully. "Mr. Morgan," she said, "did you return the funds when you made that decision?" My father hesitated. "We intended to," he said, "but the trip was still used for family bonding." Mark spoke before the judge could respond. "Your Honor, the only bonding was among the beneficiaries of someone else's trust." The defense objected, but the judge waved it off. I could see my father's jaw tighten. He turned toward me, his voice lowering to something sharp. "You're ungrateful, Avery. Everything you have came from me." I met his eyes steady. "No," I said quietly. "Everything I have came from him." The room fell silent. Even the air felt still. The judge leaned forward, eyes firm. "I've heard enough," she said. Her gavel came down once clean and final. "This court finds sufficient evidence of financial abuse. Robert Morgan. Diane Morgan. Valerie Brooks and Peter Brooks are ordered to repay the full amount of $2 million to Mr. Thomas Morgan. Furthermore, all four are hereby stripped of inheritance rights and guardianship privileges." The words hit like a bell, clear, resonant, impossible to ignore. My mother lowered her head, tears streaking her makeup. Valerie whispered something harsh to her husband. My father slammed his hand against the table. "You can't take away my family." The judge met his glare. "You did that yourself, Mr. Morgan." When it was over, Mark gathered the folders, offering me a quiet nod. "It's done," he said. Outside, the sunlight felt warmer than it had in weeks. I stood on the courthouse steps, letting the breeze wash over me. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a single text from Grandpa. "Home yet?" I typed back, "On my way." Driving home, I watched the marshes roll by, their silver water flashing between stretches of grass. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was running from anything. Justice wasn't loud or cruel. It was quiet, firm, and overdue. When I pulled into the driveway, Grandpa was waiting on the porch. He stood slowly, shading his eyes against the sun. "It's over," I said as I climbed the steps. He didn't ask how it went. He could see the answer in my face. He just nodded, his eyes glistening. "Then they can't hurt us anymore," he said. I sat beside him, the boards warm under our feet. The garden was alive with the hum of bees again. Somewhere in the distance, a wind chime rang softly. For the first time since that day at the airport, the house didn't feel empty. It felt peaceful. Still, I knew something new was beginning. Grandpa turned toward me. "Let's not waste what's left," he said. I nodded. "No," I answered. "Let's build something better." The sun slipped lower behind the trees, washing the porch in gold. The road ahead would hold its own challenges, but as we sat there, the air felt lighter, the future closer. What had started as a fight for truth was becoming something else entirely, a chance to start again. The days after the ruling moved in slow rhythm, the kind that feels both peaceful and unfamiliar. The Charleston air was heavy with summer heat, and the garden outside Grandpa's house was alive again, the bees busy, the roses finally blooming the way he liked them. Every morning he sat on the porch with his coffee, the newspaper folded neatly beside him, a quiet satisfaction softening the edges of his face. I joined him most mornings, still adjusting to what it meant to live without fear of the next blow. One afternoon while I was sorting mail in the front hall, Grandpa called from his study. "Avery, come here." His voice carried the same strength I'd almost forgotten. I found him holding a letter, his reading glasses slipping down his nose. "It's from the court," he said, passing it to me. The paper was official confirmation that the funds had been fully restored and all restrictions placed against my father and the others were final. He leaned back in his chair, eyes glistening. "I didn't think I'd live to see justice spelled out in ink," he said quietly. That night, he asked if we could sit by the fireplace even though it was warm outside. The flames crackled low as he stared into them. "I don't want what's left of my life to be about what they did," he said. "I want to give it meaning." I listened as he spoke about the idea of a foundation, something to protect older people who'd been taken advantage of people like him, who believed love was enough to keep them safe. "It could help someone else before it's too late," he said. Over the next few weeks, we began putting the idea into motion. We met with a local attorney who specialized in charitable trusts and paperwork. The foundation would bear his name, the Thomas Morgan Foundation for Senior Protection. Every dollar that came back from the case was deposited into its account. Watching him sign those forms felt different than watching him sign the property deeds he used to bring home. This time, his signature wasn't about wealth. It was about purpose. I handled most of the logistics while he focused on the vision. Some days he sat by the window drafting letters to local community centers, and other days he called old business contacts, asking them to donate supplies or volunteer time. He'd always been good with people, even after everything that happened. There was a steadiness in his voice when he spoke about what he wanted this foundation to stand for: dignity, education, prevention. No one should have to feel useless just because someone they love stopped seeing their worth, he said once, adjusting his glasses. The first real event came together faster than either of us expected, a small grant presentation at a neighborhood community center just outside the city. The morning of the event, Grandpa dressed in his best gray suit, the same one he wore to every important moment in his life. When we arrived, the center's director greeted us at the door, her handshake firm and warm. A dozen seniors waited in the main hall, their faces lined with curiosity and quiet pride. Grandpa stepped to the front, cleared his throat, and began to speak. "I spent most of my life building things," he said, his voice low but sure. "Houses, offices, even this city in small ways. But I forgot the most important structure protecting the people who built me." The room was silent, except for the hum of the air conditioner. He looked around at the faces watching him. "You're not invisible. You're not forgotten. And as long as I have breath left, I'll make sure of that." The applause that followed wasn't loud, but it carried something deeper. I watched him shake hands with each person, listen to their stories, promise to return. When we left, he stopped by the car and took a deep breath. "I haven't felt this alive in a long time," he said. Back home, I noticed a change in him. He moved slower, but with purpose. He ate better, slept longer, and smiled more often. Some evenings we sat on the porch, and he'd talk about his plans, more centers, outreach programs, maybe even scholarships for social workers. "You'll have to keep it going after I'm gone," he'd joke gently, though his tone carried a quiet truth beneath the humor. I always told him not to talk like that, but deep down, I knew what he meant. One late afternoon while I was organizing documents for the foundation, I heard the faint notes of the old piano drifting from the parlor. Grandpa hadn't touched it in years. When I stepped closer, he was there, his fingers pressing softly on the keys, the melody shaky but full of feeling. He looked up and smiled when he saw me. "I used to play this for your grandmother," he said. "She said it sounded like forgiveness." We sat there for a while, the music filling the house that had once echoed with silence. I thought about how far we'd come from that day at the airport, the humiliation, the heartbreak, the anger. Now the air felt lighter, the rooms warmer. The house no longer belonged to a wounded man. It belonged to a survivor rebuilding his legacy. A week later, we hosted a small dinner for the volunteers helping with the foundation. It wasn't fancy, just stew, cornbread, and lemonade served under the porch lights, but the laughter around that table filled the night like music. At one point, Grandpa raised his glass. "To second chances," he said. and to the people who remind us that love can still grow where trust once broke. After everyone left, I stayed behind to wash dishes while he lingered outside watching the stars. When I joined him, he looked up and said, "You saved me, Avery." I shook my head. "No, Grandpa. You saved yourself. I just stood beside you." He smiled faintly. "Then I guess we saved each other." That night before going to bed, I walked through the house one last time. The scent of old wood and fresh flowers mixed in the air. On his desk in the study, the folder marked Foundation Charter sat beside a framed photo of the two of us from the grant event, his hand resting on my shoulder. For the first time, the house didn't feel like a museum of broken trust. It felt alive again, every corner humming with new purpose. Still, as I turned off the lights, I couldn't shake a small ache in my chest. His energy had started to fade a little in recent days, and though he never mentioned it, I noticed the way he sometimes leaned heavier on the porch rail or the quiet sigh he gave when he thought I wasn't listening. But he seemed content, even peaceful, as though he'd found the closure he'd been searching for. Before heading upstairs, I peeked into the study one last time. He was there asleep in his chair, the lamp still glowing softly beside him. His breathing was steady, his hand resting on the photo. I thought about waking him, but didn't. He looked at peace, and for that moment, peace felt like enough. The house settled into quiet around us, the same house that had once witnessed betrayal, now holding something far stronger healing. Outside, the magnolias swayed in the night breeze, their petals brushing against the window panes like soft reminders that even after everything breaks, life finds a way to bloom again. And as the clock ticked past midnight, I knew this wasn't the end of our story, only the beginning of what his love and courage would leave behind. I woke early the next morning to a stillness that felt different. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't belong to sleep, but to something deeper. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting thin lines across the hallway floor. I went downstairs expecting to find Grandpa at the kitchen table with his coffee and newspaper, but the chair was empty. The pot on the counter was cold. Something in me shifted. I walked toward the study, my steps slowing as I reached the door. The lamp was still on, its warm light falling across the papers scattered on his desk. The foundation documents, a stack of handwritten notes, and the photo of us from the grant event. Grandpa sat in his armchair, his head tilted gently to the side, his hands resting on that photo. His expression was calm, almost smiling, as if he'd just drifted off mid-thought. For a moment I stood frozen in the doorway, unable to breathe. Then slowly I crossed the room and knelt beside him. His skin was cool beneath my fingers. The clock on the mantel ticked softly, marking the moment I realized he was gone. The days that followed moved like water, steady, ungraspable. The funeral was small, just close friends, a few people from the foundation, and Mark Ellis, who came quietly and stood in the back. The chapel smelled faintly of lilies and wood polish. I'd written a eulogy, but barely looked at the page. "He taught me that strength doesn't always look loud," I said, my voice shaking. "Sometimes it's just the way someone keeps showing up for others, even when no one's watching." When it was over, I stayed behind as the others left, the last echoes of footsteps fading down the aisle. I placed my hand on the casket, tracing the grain of the wood. "You did it, Grandpa," I whispered. "You left more than they ever could take." That night the house felt impossibly large. Every sound, the creak of the floorboards, the whisper of the wind through the magnolias, seemed louder without him there. I found myself in his study again, sitting in the same chair he'd used every morning. On the desk was a sealed envelope with my name written in his careful handwriting. My heart thudded as I opened it. Inside was a single page. "Avery," it read. "If you're reading this, I probably didn't get the chance to say goodbye the way I wanted. You gave me more years than I deserved, not because of medicine or time, but because you reminded me what life still meant. Keep the foundation alive. Not for my name, but for everyone who thinks their voice doesn't matter. You made mine heard. Now make others heard too." The paper trembled in my hands. I folded it carefully and placed it back in the envelope. There was no need to cry. It felt more like a gentle ache, the kind that lives quietly beside gratitude. Over the next few weeks, I handled what needed to be done, legal papers, estate matters, the continuation of the foundation. Mark helped with the logistics, patient and kind as always. He left things in good order, he said one afternoon as we went over the documents. You can tell he trusted you. I nodded, though my throat felt tight. When the time came to sort through Grandpa's personal things, I did it slowly. His closet still smelled faintly of cedar and old cologne. In a small box on the top shelf I found keepsakes from his early life, black and white photos, faded business cards, a brass compass engraved with the initials TM. I turned it over and saw an inscription scratched into the back, "Find your way home." I kept that compass on my desk after that. It became a quiet reminder of the direction he'd set for me. A month later, I organized a memorial event through the foundation, a celebration, not a mourning. We held it at the same community center where Grandpa had given his first speech. The walls were decorated with photos of him shaking hands, smiling, laughing. People came from all over, volunteers, donors, seniors he'd helped. They shared stories one after another about how his kindness had changed something small but lasting in their lives. When it was my turn to speak, I looked around the room and felt the same warmth I'd seen on his face that day. Thomas Morgan believed that family is built by love, not blood, I said. He proved that by giving others what his own family couldn't give him: respect, safety, and hope. The room fell silent for a moment before the applause began. It wasn't loud, but it carried through the air like sunlight through open windows. Afterward, as I packed up the display boards and folded chairs, a woman approached me. She was elderly, her silver hair pulled into a neat bun. "Your grandfather helped me last year," she said. "He made me feel seen again. You should be proud." I smiled softly. "I am," I said, "every day." Driving home that evening, the sky glowed with streaks of pink and gold. The road back to Charleston felt familiar yet different, as if the city itself had shifted in his absence. When I reached the estate, the porch light was on, casting a circle of warmth across the steps. I sat there for a long time, watching the horizon fade to blue, listening to the rustle of the garden he'd tended with such care. In the weeks that followed, letters began arriving, thank you notes, requests for assistance, even a few checks from people who wanted to contribute to the foundation. One envelope stood out, addressed in careful handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a short note from Jenna, my cousin. "Avery," it read, "I heard about the foundation. I'm sorry for how things turned out. Grandpa deserved better. We all did. I want to volunteer if you'll let me." I sat with that letter for a long time. It didn't erase what had happened, but it felt like the smallest crack in a long, cold wall. I wrote back the next day. "There's always work to be done. You're welcome to help." That weekend she showed up at the office, a little nervous but sincere. We spent the morning sorting boxes of donated supplies. At one point she looked up and said, "He really loved you, you know." I smiled faintly. He loved us all. Some of us just took longer to see it. By the time she left that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't in a long time, peace mixed with a quiet sense of forgiveness. The kind Grandpa had always carried in his eyes. That night, I walked through the garden under the soft hum of crickets. The air was thick with the scent of roses and damp earth. I stopped by the fountain, its water glinting in the moonlight, and looked up at the stars. For the first time, I didn't feel alone. The wind picked up rustling the leaves, and I could almost hear his voice in it, steady, patient kind. The man who had taught me the real meaning of family wasn't gone. He was everywhere in the foundation's work, in the laughter of the people he'd helped, in the strength he'd passed down through every choice I made. And as I turned back toward the house, the windows glowing warm against the night, I knew exactly what he'd want me to do next. Keep building, keep protecting, and keep choosing love over everything else. The following spring, the magnolias bloomed early. Their petals drifted down onto the porch steps, pale and soft against the weathered wood. The house didn't feel empty anymore. It felt alive, filled with the quiet hum of purpose. I'd kept every part of Grandpa's foundation going just as he asked. The team had grown new volunteers, new partners, even new families, finding their way through our doors. Every week someone walked in carrying a story that reminded me why we began. One morning, as I unlocked the office, I found a letter waiting on the front desk. It was from a woman in Savannah who'd attended one of our workshops. She wrote about how she'd stopped her nephew from draining her savings after hearing our talk on financial guardianship. "Your grandfather's name saved me," she wrote. I held that letter for a long time before placing it in the small wooden box where I kept others like it. There were dozens now, each one proof that his voice still echoed beyond the walls of Charleston. Jenna had become one of the Foundation's most active volunteers. She handled outreach programs and never missed a meeting. Sometimes when I caught her helping an elderly couple fill out their forms, I saw the same softness in her expression that Grandpa once carried. One afternoon she looked up from her desk and said, "He'd be proud of this, Avery. Of you." I smiled, knowing she was right, but I also knew he'd be proud of her too. In small, quiet ways, our family was finding its way back, not through apologies, but through action. As for my parents, the last I'd heard, they'd moved out west. There were no calls, no letters. For a long time, that silence hurt. But over time, I learned to see it as peace instead of loss. Some doors don't need to be closed twice. Grandpa used to say that forgiveness isn't always an invitation, it's just a release. I think I finally understood what he meant. Late one evening after finishing paperwork, I walked out to the garden. The fountain shimmered under the moonlight, and the roses swayed gently in the breeze. I sat on the bench where Grandpa used to read the paper and let the night settle around me. It had been almost a year since he passed, yet I still felt him everywhere in the rhythm of the waves beyond the property, in the creak of the porch swing, in every small act of kindness that carried his name forward. I thought about how much had changed since that day at the airport, the betrayal, the anger, the courtroom. All of it had once felt like the end of something, but now I saw it differently. It wasn't the end at all. It was the moment the truth finally began to breathe. Justice had given him peace, but love had given him a legacy. And that legacy was still growing, one story at a time. The next morning, I visited the community center where it all began. A new plaque had been installed in the lobby brass with engraved letters that read, "The Thomas Morgan Foundation, a promise kept." I ran my fingers over the words and felt a lump rise in my throat. Around me, laughter filled the hall. Volunteers setting up tables, seniors chatting over coffee. It was exactly what he'd wanted life moving forward. When I stepped outside, the sunlight spilled across the street, and a soft wind carried the scent of salt from the harbor. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was standing in his shadow. I was walking in his light. People sometimes ask what I learned from all of it, what justice really means, and I always tell them this: justice isn't about revenge or winning. It's about restoring what was broken and choosing not to let bitterness be the final word. My grandfather didn't get the family he dreamed of, but he left the world a little kinder, a little stronger, and in the end, that's what mattered most. As I locked the door that evening, the golden hours spilling across the garden, I looked up at the sky and whispered, "We're still building, Grandpa." Somewhere deep inside, I could almost hear his laugh, low, warm, and steady like it always was. If you've ever fought for your own peace or helped someone find theirs, you know what that laugh feels like. Hold on to it. And if this story stays with you, share it with someone who needs a reminder that goodness can outlive the pain, because it can, and it does.